Nazi Germany not only changed the course of World War II, but also left a complex and surprising legacy, full of technological advances, unusual obsessions, and unimaginable horrors. Behind its leaders, the army, and its ideology lay secrets that reveal the audacity, cruelty, and, at times, the paradox of a regime that combined modernity and barbarism. In this documentary, we will explore 21 shocking facts that show everything from medical experiments and financial conspiracies to secret plans and unexpected curiosities, offering a deep and fascinating look at the most extreme world that Europe has ever known. Nazi power cocktail, drug experiments to create superhuman soldiers. During World War II, the Nazi regime was obsessed with finding any advantage that could ensure victory, and this included exploring the limits of science applied to warfare. One of the most extreme and least known experiments was the development of a drug cocktail designed to enhance the physical and mental stamina of soldiers. This mixture, which combined oxycodone, cocaine, and methamphetamine, was created by Nazi scientists in secret military laboratories with the intention of transforming soldiers into what were considered perfect warriors. The test subjects were selected from elite troops, and the initial effects seemed to meet the expectations of the Third Reich. Those who received the combination were able to march for more than 90 kilometers a day, carrying backpacks of up to 20 kilograms without showing signs of fatigue. The drug also temporarily increased concentration and reduced the perception of pain, allowing soldiers to maintain an extraordinary combat pace for days. In theory, this offered an impressive strategic advantage. Units capable of covering enormous distances and maintaining pressure on enemies without rest. However, ethics and safety were completely ignored. The side effects were devastating. Psychological and physical dependence developed rapidly, and many soldiers suffered mental breakdowns after periods of heavy use. The regime's obsession with military efficiency left no room for human consideration. The lives of soldiers became an experiment in themselves. In many cases, the results were unpredictable and could be lethal. This program also reflects Nazism's characteristic combination of science and ideology. For Hitler and his officers, experimentation had no limits, as long as it contributed to strengthening Germany's military power. The drug mixture became a tool to maximize obedience, resistance, and performance, elements that were seen as essential to the regime's plans for expansion and conquest. Furthermore, these experiments grimly foreshadowed what would later be known as the use of stimulants in the armed forces of other countries. Beyond its immediate military application, this cocktail is an example of the extreme mentality of the Third Reich, a system in which science was used to achieve military objectives at the expense of morality, ethics, and human life. The soldiers turned into superhumans were in reality expendable instruments, pieces in a large-scale experiment designed to test the limits of human endurance and ideological obedience. This fact reminds us that behind the Nazi war machine, there were stories of terrifying innovation and human suffering that remain difficult to comprehend even decades later. Rebel subs, underwater disobedience, and secret trips to South America. As the Third Reich collapsed in the final months of World War II, Nazi Germany faced military defeats that followed one another at an unstoppable pace. The Allied forces were advancing from the west and the Red Army from the east, leading Berlin to an inevitable collapse. However, even in this scenario of total defeat, certain German submarine officers and crews demonstrated a surprising level of audacity and disobedience, carrying out operations that to this day are shrouded in mystery and legend. Two Kriegsmarine submarines, whose exact designations remain partially unknown, refused to surrender when the city of Berlin fell to the Red Army. Defying orders to surrender, these vessels remained submerged for weeks, secretly sailing across the Atlantic to South America. According to the accounts, one of these missions included the landing of a Nazi officer at an undisclosed port before the submarines continued their journey. This act of defiance reflects not only the crew's extreme discipline and training, but also their ideological loyalty to a regime that was already defeated in practice. The logistics of keeping a submarine submerged for such a long period were extraordinary. The U-boats, as they were known, were not designed for transatlantic voyages of this duration without external resupply. The crews had to ration food, oxygen, and fuel while sailing in total isolation, facing the extreme physical and psychological stress of living underwater for weeks. This feat requires understanding that these submarines were, in essence, sealed capsules of human survival, operated by men who carried with them the mixture of desperation, loyalty, and determination that characterized the Nazi elite forces to the very end. The final destination of these journeys remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts suggest that these submarines managed to reach South American shores, where Nazi officers may have tried to hide from the Allied advance. These journeys later fueled numerous theories about the escape of Nazis to Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, many of them using escape networks known as rat lines, which facilitated the clandestine entry of former officials and scientists of the Third Reich into Latin America. The story of these rebel submarines became a symbol of the ability of certain individuals to carry out daring operations, even as their world crumbled around them. Beyond the legend, these events show a fascinating aspect of war, the mix of technological innovation, military discipline, and individual decisions that could defy even clear orders to surrender. The rebel submarines not only represent an act of disobedience, but also the persistence of Nazi ideology in its last followers, willing to defy fate to keep their loyalty to their cause alive. This episode illustrates how, even in the final moments of the conflict, the Nazi war was marked by extreme acts, secrecy, and mystery that still intrigues historians and military history enthusiasts today. Evidence of horror, Eisenhower, and the documentation of the Holocaust. As the Allied armies advanced into the heart of Germany, the magnitude of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime became evident. Aware that history could be distorted and that some would deny the horrors of the Holocaust, US President Dwight Eisenhower made the decision to systematically document the evidence of the atrocities. This action not only sought to record historical truth, but also to ensure that humanity would not forget the limits of cruelty to which a totalitarian regime could go. Eisenhower ordered that thousands of photographs, films, and testimonies be taken from the concentration camps liberated by the Allied troops. He personally visited some of these places, including Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, where he was deeply shocked by what he saw. Piles of corpses, starving survivors, and evidence of mass executions. His impression was clear. It was necessary for everyone to know what had happened so that these horrors would not be repeated. The documentation included both visual and oral evidence. Survivors of the concentration camps offered detailed accounts of their experiences, describing the inhumane conditions, medical experiments, executions, and the daily routine of terror that defined these places. Eisenhower understood that the most effective evidence against deniers would be a thorough and incontestable record, an archive that could withstand any attempt at historical manipulation. These actions had a lasting impact on the collective memory of the Holocaust. The photographs and films taken under his supervision were used in the Nuremberg trials and became essential tools for education about the Nazi genocide. Beyond its legal value, the documentation helped the world understand the magnitude of the barbarity and the scale of human suffering inflicted by the Third Reich. Eisenhower acted not only for immediate justice, but also out of historical responsibility. His decision to preserve every visual and testimonial piece of evidence demonstrated a deep understanding of history, that without tangible proof, even the most heinous crimes could be forgotten or denied. Thus, the legacy of his action was twofold: to record the truth and to ensure that humanity learned from the past. The ideal German soldier, Werner Goldberg, an unexpected icon. During World War II, Nazi propaganda sought to shape the image of the perfect soldier, strong, disciplined, and representative of the Aryan race that Hitler exalted as superior. This ideal was constructed through posters, magazines, films, and all kinds of communication materials that portrayed the German soldier as an aspirational, heroic, and physically impeccable role model. In this context, Werner Goldberg became an unexpected symbol. His youthful face, harmonious features, and distinguished bearing made him stand out in photographs and official publications, earning him the nickname the ideal German soldier. The Nazis used his image as an emblem of the type of man all young Germans should aspire to be, projecting discipline, strength, and obedience to the fatherland. The irony of Goldberg's story is profound and revealing. Despite being the face of the perfect soldier, Goldberg was half Jewish, which, according to the strict racial policies of the Third Reich, made him categorically ineligible to be part of the army or the Aryan society that the regime promoted. However, the Nazi propaganda machine ignored this essential detail. What mattered was the effectiveness of the visual message, not the biographical truth of the individual. This contrast between reality and the official narrative reveals the arbitrariness of the Nazi ideological apparatus, capable of distorting the truth without any qualms when it suited its purposes of mass manipulation. Goldberg himself lived under constant tension. He was fully aware of his origins and the risks involved, since any revelation of his Jewish lineage could mean persecution, exclusion, and even death. While his face appeared on posters all over Germany, his real life was marked by vulnerability and the need to hide his true identity. This dual role, public symbol of an ideal that personally excluded him, demonstrates how propaganda could construct myths and heroes that distorted reality, prioritizing image over moral, legal, or racial coherence. The use of Goldberg as a propaganda emblem also reflects a historical paradox. A regime obsessed with racial purity and discipline was willing to sacrifice truth in the name of communicative effectiveness. Goldberg's story demonstrates that for the Third Reich, the image could be more powerful than reality, and that the visual construction of the ideal was more important than the veracity of the individuals who embodied it. Her face represented the perfection that the Nazis wanted to project, even if that perfection existed only on a symbolic and advertising level. Beyond the irony, Goldberg's life offers a lesson on the complexity of identity in times of war and totalitarianism. Being the ideal soldier meant carrying a symbol that did not correspond to the truth and, at the same time, surviving in a regime where the revelation of his Jewish ancestry could be deadly. This duality between public myth and personal reality reflects both the tragedy and the irony of the era. The propaganda of the Third Reich not only manipulated the masses but also the lives of those who, by chance or circumstance, became emblematic figures of a system of terror. The story of Werner Goldberg is, ultimately, an example of how the image can be instrumentalized for ideological purposes and how an individual's life can come into constant tension with the narratives imposed by a totalitarian regime. His face remains as a testament to the contradiction between propaganda and reality, reminding us that behind every symbol of power there may be a complex story of survival, irony, and silent resistance. Animal lovers, animal protection under the Third Reich. Despite the violence, war, and genocide that defined the Nazi regime, some leaders of the Third Reich showed a surprising interest in animals and nature. Adolf Hitler, Hermann Göring, and other high-ranking officials actively promoted animal protection laws, which included strict regulations on hunting, cruelty to animals, and experimentation on them. These laws prohibited practices that today would be considered basic in terms of animal welfare, but in that context they were exceptional for the time. Hitler even adopted a vegetarian lifestyle during the last years of his life, driven by a combination of ethical beliefs, personal superstitions, and an obsession with bodily purity that was also reflected in his racial and social policies. This approach to animals stands in stark contrast to the way the regime treated human beings. While animal welfare laws were being enacted, millions of people were being systematically persecuted, deported, and murdered. Jews, communists, gypsies, homosexuals, and other groups considered undesirable were victims of a planned and methodical extermination, with no regard for human life or suffering. The paradox is evident. A regime capable of caring about the welfare of animals demonstrated at the same time infinite cruelty towards its own citizens. This extreme contradiction reveals not only the moral inconsistency of the Nazi leaders, but also how power and ideology could completely distort ethical values. Interest in animals was also used as a propaganda tool. Portraying Hitler and other leaders as protectors of wildlife and nature lovers helped to project an image of humanity and selective sensitivity. The photos, speeches, and articles published in regime magazines emphasized this soft side of the leaders, attempting to soften the public perception of a government that, in reality, perpetrated unimaginable atrocities. This calculated contrast between humanity towards animals and brutality towards humans reinforced the Nazi narrative that certain groups were inherently inferior and therefore expendable, while the Aryan race and its natural environment should be preserved and exalted. Furthermore, The Nazi obsession with animals extended to education and youth. The Nazi Party promoted programs in schools and youth organizations, such as the Hitler Youth, to instill respect for nature, the protection of wildlife, and discipline in the care of animals. These teachings were presented as part of the formation of the ideal citizen, physically strong, morally upright, and in harmony with nature, but also completely aligned with the racial ideology of the regime. The combination of education, propaganda, and legislation shows how Nazi ideology could penetrate all aspects of life, selectively and strategically imposing values. Animal protection under the Third Reich became an example of the regime's ability to apply its ethical beliefs in an extremely selective manner. While the lives of millions of humans were considered irrelevant or expendable, animals were subject to care, regulation, and strict protection. This surprising fact underscores the complexity and extreme contradiction of Nazism, a mixture of obsession with perfection, media manipulation, instrumental morality, and ethical perversity. History demonstrates how a government can use compassion in a calculated way to cover up its cruelty, and how ideology can transform even animal protection into an instrument of propaganda, leaving a disturbing and deeply paradoxical historical legacy. Operation Forgery, Nazi plan to destroy the British economy. In 1939, the Nazi regime launched one of the boldest, most complex, and least known plans of World War II, the mass counterfeiting of the pound sterling with the aim of destabilizing the British economy. This project, known as Operation Bernhard, sought to flood the market with high-quality counterfeit banknotes, generate inflation, and undermine confidence in the currency, thus weakening the enemy not only on the battlefield but also in the financial and economic arena. The initiative reflects the combination of ingenuity, pragmatism, and brutality that characterized the Third Reich, and demonstrates how war was conceived as a total conflict encompassing all spheres of society. To carry out this operation, the Nazis used concentration camps, with Sachsenhausen being one of the main places where the project was executed. There, forced prisoners, many of them experts in printing, graphic design, and typography, worked in extreme conditions. The lives of these men depended on the perfection of their work. One mistake could be fatal, and any delay or failure was severely punished. This combination of technical talent and brutal coercion makes Operation Bernhard a paradigmatic example of how the Nazi regime instrumentalized human science, skill, and creativity in the service of criminal ends. The technical precision of the banknotes produced was truly impressive. The counterfeiters meticulously reproduced the most sophisticated features of the originals: watermarks, security threads, paper textures, special inks, and even the micro-details of the engravings. It is estimated that more than £132 million sterling were produced, equivalent to about £7 billion today. This figure demonstrates the ambition and magnitude of the project, showing that the Nazis conceived of counterfeiting as an economic weapon capable of affecting not only the war, but also the social and political stability of the enemy. Despite the technical sophistication and the number of banknotes produced, the plan never reached its full potential. Mass distribution during an active conflict proved extremely complicated, and only a portion of the banknotes managed to infiltrate the British economy. Even so, Operation Bernhard left a significant symbolic and strategic impact, illustrating how the Third Reich viewed war as a multifaceted instrument that combined military force, espionage, and economic manipulation. The project also highlights the inherent cruelty of the regime. Prisoners were treated as mere instruments, and their lives were completely subordinated to the objectives of the state. However, despite the human suffering, the operation reflects a level of technological and organizational sophistication that, from a technical point of view, is remarkable. The planning, coordination, and execution of the counterfeiting required advanced knowledge of printing, currency security, and logistics, making Operation Bernhard a historic milestone in economic warfare. The legacy of this operation goes beyond the context of World War II. Counterfeit banknotes became a symbol of human ingenuity applied to criminal purposes, and their study has provided valuable information on counterfeiting techniques, espionage, and economic warfare. Operation Bernhard demonstrates how Nazism mixed science, crime, and military strategy to try to dominate Europe from all possible fronts. reminding us that the conflict was not limited to violence on the battlefields, but also included sophisticated maneuvers to control the economy, information, and public perception of the enemy. Forced Germanization, kidnapping of racially superior Polish children. Nazi racial ideology was not limited solely to the persecution and extermination of certain groups. It also included social engineering programs designed to improve the German population in accordance with the ideals of racial purity. One of the most shocking and least known examples of this policy was the kidnapping and forced Germanization of Polish children considered racially superior. Thousands of children were torn from their families, often violently, and transported to Germany, where they were subjected to a systematic process of cultural, linguistic, and physical indoctrination. The regime's objective was to integrate them into German society as citizens of the Reich, transforming their original identities into an artificial construct that met the standards of Nazi ideology. The Germanization process was ruthless and meticulously planned. The kidnapped children were evaluated according to specific racial criteria, including physical features, hair and eye color, and cultural aptitudes. Those who met the standards were taken in by German families, enrolled in Third Reich educational institutions, or trained in military and labor programs. Meanwhile, they were forbidden any contact with their Polish roots. Their original names were removed, they were taught German as the sole language, they were instilled with customs, habits, and symbols of Nazi culture, and they were subjected to an education that reinforced the values of the regime. For those who did not meet the racial or ideological criteria, the fate was even crueler. Many were discarded, sent to other re-education institutions, or in some cases destined for death in extermination programs or forced labor. After the war, only about 10% of these children managed to return to their original families, leaving a legacy of deep trauma, fragmented identity, and memories of physical, psychological, and cultural abuse. Germanization not only destroyed the childhood of these children, but also irreversibly altered their sense of belonging and their family ties. This program of kidnapping and Germanization reveals the extent of the ideological power and the manipulative capacity of the Nazi machine. It was not simply a matter of imposing discipline or control, it was a deliberate attempt to redefine human identity according to racial criteria, transforming individuals into pieces of a broader demographic and cultural project. The combination of pseudoscience, educational indoctrination, and physical coercion demonstrates the extent to which the Nazis were willing to intervene in the lives of the most vulnerable to achieve their goals of purity and racial homogeneity. Furthermore, this episode demonstrates the effectiveness of brainwashing and the ability of a totalitarian state to shape beliefs, habits, and values from childhood. Through kidnapping and Germanization, the Nazis not only sought to alter the present of these children, but also aspired to influence the demographic and ethnic future of Europe, ensuring that subsequent generations would reflect their distorted view of racial superiority. This extreme control over childhood is a chilling testament to how ideology can instrumentalize education, culture, and biology for totalitarian purposes, transforming lives and entire societies. The story of these kidnapped children is a grim reminder of the destructive power of totalitarian regimes and how childhood can become a field of social and political experimentation. Forced Germanization not only inflicted immediate suffering, but also left psychological and social scars that lasted for decades, reminding the world of the dangers of ideological manipulation and systematic violence applied against the most innocent. It is, without a doubt, one of the cruelest and most revealing chapters of the Nazi machine. Obsession with Switzerland, Hitler's failed plan against Alpine neutrality. As his expansion progressed in Europe during the early years of World War II, Adolf Hitler developed an intense obsession with Switzerland, a country that remained neutral in the face of international conflicts and which, from the Führer's perspective, represented a symbolic and strategic obstacle. For Hitler, Switzerland was not just a small, independent country. It was a thorn in the side of Europe, an example of passive resistance that challenged the Third Reich's vision of absolute control over the continent. Its neutrality and financial stability gave it a symbolic power that contrasted with the rapid and brutal German expansion, generating a mixture of frustration and fascination in the Nazi leader. From 1939 onwards, the Nazis began to draw up detailed plans to subdue Switzerland. taking into account both its strategic location and its economic importance. The idea was not just to occupy a territory, it was about consolidating dominance over Central Europe, ensuring control of trade routes, banks and financial resources, and eliminating any examples of independence that could challenge German authority. The maps, simulations, and military plans drawn up by the German High Command showed a carefully designed invasion, with troop contingents assigned to strategic points and logistical operations calculated to overcome the Swiss geography. However, the challenge was monumental. Switzerland had a naturally fortified terrain, dominated by the Alps, narrow valleys and mountain passes that hindered any military advance. Furthermore, the nation was prepared to defend itself. Its population was organized and trained with a resistance strategy known as the National Defense Network, which provided for fortifications, supply depots, and a military force capable of slowing down or repelling even a larger army. The combination of geographical obstacles and human defenses meant that a direct invasion would be extremely costly and risky, forcing Hitler and his generals to reconsider the feasibility of the operation in light of the dispersion of resources on other fronts of the war. The invasion plans, although meticulous and sophisticated, were never executed. Geography, Swiss neutrality, and the country's political firmness prevented Germany from achieving its objective. This fact reveals how Hitler's obsession did not always translate into concrete results, and how even a regime with vast military resources could face limits beyond its control. Switzerland's resistance thus became a symbol that not all obstacles in Europe could be overcome by force, and that geographical and social factors could thwart even the most ambitious plans of the Third Reich. Hitler's fascination with Switzerland also had a psychological and symbolic component. Conquering the country would have represented not only a territorial victory, but a blow to the very concept of neutrality and autonomy in the face of Nazi power. Germany's inability to invade Switzerland shows that despite his relentless expansion, even Hitler had to face strategic, geographical, and political limits that he could not overcome with military force or intimidation. This episode reflects the complex interplay between personal obsession, military planning, and recognition of reality, demonstrating that the Führer's vision sometimes clashed with the harshness of the physical world and the determination of small but prepared states. Ultimately, the story of the Nazi obsession with Switzerland is an example of how a totalitarian regime could become obsessed with absolute control, but also of how geography, preparedness, and national resilience could check even the most powerful armies. Switzerland remained neutral and secure, serving as a reminder that resistance, while not always heroic in the military sense, could exert a significant influence against the most relentless expansionism. Hitler's humor, personal jokes amidst horror. Adolf Hitler is remembered as one of the cruelest and most ruthless dictators in history, but even in his personal life he maintained unexpected habits and behaviors that contrasted with the brutality of his actions. Among these aspects is his sense of humor, which, although macabre in some cases, was part of his daily life and the way he related to his closest collaborators. Hitler collected jokes that he enjoyed telling repeatedly and sometimes used them to break the tension in political or military meetings. His favorite joke, according to accounts from those around him, involved Hermann Göring, a high-ranking official of the regime, and his wife. In it, Göring appeared raising his underpants to overpants, an absurd image that provoked laughter from the Führer. This type of humor reflects an attempt at normality within an environment marked by violence and the planning of genocide, a disturbing reminder that Hitler's personality combined trivial human traits with decisions of catastrophic scope. Hitler's interest in humor did not diminish even in the face of war or the suffering of millions. His jokes, though seemingly innocuous, were also a mechanism of social control. They reinforced the closeness with his most loyal followers and generated an atmosphere of selective camaraderie, isolating those who did not share his complicity. The ability to alternate between acts of extreme cruelty and moments of everyday humor demonstrates the complexity of his personality and the ethical disconnect that characterized the Nazi regime. This aspect of Hitler serves to humanize him in a dangerous way, reminding us that even those responsible for crimes of massive proportions can have trivial habits or laughs, which makes their evil even more disturbing. By documenting these personal facets, historians seek to better understand the mind of a dictator, how the power dynamics were formed in his inner circle, and how the everyday and the criminal could coexist in the same individual without apparent contradiction. Hitler's humor, though seemingly harmless, becomes a mirror of the duality of power and perversity, a reminder that evil can coexist with seemingly human gestures, and that understanding these contradictions is essential to studying the history of the Third Reich and the nature of totalitarian leadership. Book Burning and Warning: The Prophecy of Heinrich Heine. The burning of books in Nazi Germany was not an isolated or merely symbolic act. It constituted a direct prelude to the genocide, cultural censorship, and ideological manipulation that would define the Third Reich in the following years. In May 1933, the first book burning organized by the regime took place, in which hundreds of texts considered subversive were publicly destroyed in squares and university campuses. Among these works was a play by Heinrich Heine, written more than a century earlier, which contained a warning that would prove prophetic. When they burn books, in the end, they will also burn people. This phrase, which at the time seemed like a literary reflection on intolerance, was transformed into a chilling prediction of the systematic violence that would unfold under Nazism. The selection of books for burning was not random nor limited to literature. It included works by Jewish, communist, socialist, liberal authors, and any thought that was considered contrary to Nazi ideology. Literature, philosophy, science, history, and art were reviewed and censored so that no dissenting voice could influence society. This elimination of ideas sought to impose an absolute monopoly on thought, ensuring that citizens accepted without question the party's narrative, the glorification of the Aryan race, and the dehumanization of those who were considered enemies of the Reich. The act of burning books also had a strong propaganda component. The public burnings, accompanied by speeches from youth leaders and academics aligned with the regime, served as a spectacle of power, intimidating intellectuals, professors, and students. The destruction of books, more than a simple symbolic gesture, sent a clear message. The power of the Third Reich was absolute, and its control over culture and education was unquestionable. This cultural control paved the way for accepting extreme policies, including the systematic persecution and, ultimately, the extermination of entire groups of the population. What began with the burning of words and ideas soon translated into the destruction of human lives, literally fulfilling Heinrich Heine's warning. The burning of books symbolizes the relationship between culture, power, and violence in a totalitarian state. The act demonstrates how the manipulation of information and censorship can precede and facilitate extreme forms of social control and repression. Education, literature, and philosophy ceased to be spaces of intellectual freedom and became tools to reinforce an ideology of hate. Society was conditioned to normalize intolerance, discrimination, and violence, showing that attacking culture can be a preliminary step towards accepting genocide. The legacy of this action persists in historical memory as a universal warning about the dangers of censorship, intolerance, and authoritarianism. Heine's phrase has become a symbol that transcends eras, reminding us that the destruction of ideas is a dangerous precursor to the destruction of human lives. The Nazi book burnings offer a chilling lesson on how a totalitarian regime can instrumentalize culture as a tool of repression and control, demonstrating that censorship is not just a symbolic attack, but a strategy to shape society, limit freedom, and prepare the population to accept the unacceptable. Studying these events today is essential to understanding how propaganda and cultural manipulation can open the door to mass atrocities. The burning of books in Germany was not an isolated event. It was part of a systematic process that sought to eliminate all opposition, suppress intellectual diversity, and ensure blind obedience to the regime. This chapter of Nazi history serves as a reminder that defending freedom of thought and expression is fundamental to preventing absolute power from turning words into weapons and culture into instruments of death. War criminals and cover-up: the United States and the Nazis. After the end of World War II, as the world tried to rebuild and bring those responsible for the Holocaust to justice, the United States became an unexpected destination for some Nazi war criminals. For decades, certain individuals linked to the regime found asylum, logistical support, and the possibility of rebuilding their lives far from Europe, in a country that had become a world leader after the conflict. The presence of these Nazis in the United States was not initially public. Documents and files remained classified, and information about their activities was kept hidden under the justification of the Cold War, which prioritized security and technological knowledge over historical justice. Some of these individuals had skills in engineering, weaponry, or rocketry, which made them valuable to US military and scientific programs. This combination of strategic utility and lack of scrutiny allowed the presence of war criminals to continue for decades. Over time, the Freedom of Information Act allowed historians and journalists access to records that revealed the extent of the cover-up. It was discovered that the United States had offered refuge, protection, and, in some cases, job integration to individuals directly involved in war crimes, while other nations sought their capture and prosecution. This contradiction reflects the complexity of the post-war period, where justice and international politics often came into conflict. The fact that some Nazis lived in the United States until they were discovered decades later raises debates about ethics, historical responsibility, and the tension between strategic interests and moral justice. The story of these individuals serves as a warning. The fight against impunity is complex and sometimes conflicts with international politics, and historical memory requires constant vigilance to ensure that crimes do not go unpunished. Taken together, this episode reveals how the post-World War II story was not simply about rebuilding Europe and condemning the guilty. It was also a period marked by cover-ups, pragmatic decisions, and moral dilemmas that still generate controversy today. The integration of Nazi war criminals into the United States symbolizes the paradox between justice and political expediency, leaving profound lessons about ethics and historical memory. Pioneer anti-tobacco, the Nazis and the prevention of lung cancer. In an unexpected turn of events, some Nazi doctors pioneered studies on the relationship between smoking and lung cancer, decades before the world recognized the harm of cigarettes. Nazi Germany developed one of the first known anti-smoking campaigns, banning smoking in public spaces, promoting education about the risks of smoking, and regulating cigarette production. The regime promoted an ideal of physical health and racial perfection and considered that smokers weakened the body of the nation. This obsession with purity and physical efficiency extended from soldiers to the civilian population, reflecting how ideology could transform health habits into coercive state policies. The Nazi anti-smoking policy, although surprising today, aligned with their vision of absolute control over individual and collective behavior. However, this concern for health did not extend to the protection of human rights. While smoking prevention was being promoted, millions of people were persecuted and killed. This extreme contradiction demonstrates the moral selectivity of the regime. The human life of certain groups was disposable, while the health of the Aryan population was a priority objective. Nazi medical studies and the anti-smoking campaign had an impact even outside the military and racial spheres. Medical publications and statistics compiled during the war contributed to an early understanding of the risks of tobacco, although the ideological context of these studies tarnishes their scientific legacy. History shows how legitimate advances can arise in morally corrupt environments and how science can be instrumentalized by ideology. The contrast between the persecution of minorities and the concern for the physical health of the accepted population offers a profound insight into Nazi thinking, a regime capable of scientific and technological advances, but immensely destructive from an ethical and human point of view. The anti-smoking campaign is an example of how ideology can guide even everyday aspects of life, leaving a complex mark on the history of public health. Cruel therapies, experiments on homosexuality. Among the numerous and horrific experiments carried out by the Nazis during World War II were systematic attempts to correct the homosexuality of prisoners through coercive and extremely cruel methods. These experiments were carried out mainly in concentration camps and prisons under the control of the Third Reich, and were based on the erroneous and pseudo-scientific belief that heterosexuality could be imposed by force through physical, psychological, and sexual pressure. Homosexual prisoners were forced to have sex with women, often referred to as sex slaves, under conditions of humiliation, intimidation, and constant surveillance. These practices lacked scientific basis and did not seek to understand human sexuality, but rather to impose absolute conformity to the standards of Nazi ideology. The background of these experiments reveals the regime's deep obsession with racial and social purity, as well as its intolerance towards any form of difference considered a threat to the health of the nation. Homosexuality, perceived as a moral and biological deviation, was seen as a risk that weakened the structure of German society and contradicted the idealized Aryan family that Hitler promoted. Homosexual prisoners, along with Jews, communists, gypsies, and other minorities, were considered expendable, and their suffering was justified under the pretext of strengthening the morale and genetics of the German people. The violence inflicted was not limited to physical harm. It included systematic humiliation, stigmatization, and the destruction of the victim's personal and social identity. The methods used in these experiments were inhumane and often deadly. The prisoners were forced to have sex under extreme conditions with constant supervision and were subjected to severe physical punishments if they resisted. Sexual coercion was not an exception but a deliberate strategy of social and psychological control intended to break the will of individuals and subject them to the absolute power of the state. In addition to the immediate effects of pain and trauma, these practices had lasting consequences: deep psychological damage, loss of trust in humanity, and social exclusion even after liberation in the cases of survivors. These experiments demonstrate how the Nazi regime instrumentalized sexuality as a tool of repression and control. Sexual orientation, an intimate and personal characteristic, became a field of experimentation for the social engineering of the Third Reich, justifying acts of extreme torture under the guise of scientific research and racial improvement. This approach reflects the perverse logic of a totalitarian system that normalizes violence, legitimizes humiliation, and transforms difference into a reason for persecution and extermination. The study of these episodes also highlights the combination of pseudoscience, ideology, and systematic brutality that characterized Nazism. There was no ethical, medical, or humanitarian consideration. Every action was geared towards serving the objectives of the state, regardless of the human cost. The instrumentalization of sexuality and personal identity reveals the extent to which a regime can manipulate, torture, and control bodies and minds when it considers them threats to its ideological project. The legacy of these experiments is a grim reminder of the vulnerability of human rights to totalitarian ideologies. The history of homosexual prisoners and other persecuted groups demonstrates the depth of Nazi brutality and the urgent need to preserve historical memory. Understanding these facts is essential to recognizing how ideas of racial, moral, or social superiority can justify extreme atrocities, and to ensuring that such practices are not repeated in the future, remembering the importance of dignity, respect, and the protection of individual rights in any society. Coco Chanel and espionage, the designer in the service of the Third Reich. Coco Chanel, recognized worldwide as a fashion and elegance icon, had a much darker role during World War II than is commonly acknowledged. She was actively involved as a spy for the Nazis. His fascination with power, his social savvy, and his ability to move in influential circles allowed him to establish direct contacts with officials of the Third Reich. Through these relationships, Chanel was not only able to ensure the continuity of her business during the occupation of France, but she also obtained considerable economic benefits, logistical privileges, and protection from the restrictions imposed on other French citizens and businessmen during the war. Their collaboration was an example of how survival and personal success could become intertwined with politics and war in a deeply controversial way. One of the most controversial episodes of their collaboration was the appropriation of control over her famous perfume, Chanel No. 5. Originally financed and developed by a Jewish family, the perfume and its rights passed into the hands of Chanel and its allies, leaving the owning family without access to their assets or financial recognition. This fact not only demonstrates the direct exploitation of war and occupation for personal gain, but also reflects how the Third Reich encouraged or permitted these types of economic maneuvers when they served its interests. Individual ambition and war were intertwined. demonstrating that collaboration with the Nazi regime could be a tool to consolidate wealth, influence, and power. Chanel's involvement as a spy and collaborator also reveals the complexity of the French occupation. France was not only the scene of battles and resistance, it was also a terrain where certain individuals benefited from the situation, whether through pragmatism, ambition, or ideological conviction. Chanel's figure illustrates how influence and access to circles of power could be used to gain personal advantages, and how the Third Reich relied on these kinds of alliances to maintain its social and economic control, extending its dominion beyond the strictly military sphere. Furthermore, their collaboration highlights how the war transformed personal and professional relationships into instruments of survival or enrichment. Chanel, whose public image was associated with fashion, elegance, and creativity, used her social position and reputation to obtain information, establish strategic contacts, and secure material benefits. This demonstrates that the Nazi occupation not only involved repression, violence, and terror. It also created opportunities for those who knew how to maneuver within the systems of power, sometimes at the expense of ethical, moral, or legal principles. Coco Chanel's legacy during World War II continues to be a subject of debate and controversy. Although his contribution to fashion is undeniable, the evidence of his collaboration with the Nazis adds a dark dimension to his figure, transforming the narrative of individual success into a more complex tale of ambition, complicity, and opportunism. His story serves as a reminder that war and totalitarian regimes create scenarios where ethics can conflict with self-interest, and that even admired figures can have a dark side marked by morally questionable decisions. This historical chapter also invites reflection on how the history of fashion, industry, and culture cannot be separated from the political and social contexts in which it develops. Chanel's collaboration with the Third Reich demonstrates that personal ambition, cunning, and the desire for power can coexist with complicity in crimes or oppressive structures, and that war not only alters borders and governments, but also the trajectory and morality of those who live within it. Ultimately, the figure of Coco Chanel during the French occupation offers a critical look at the intersection of talent, power, and ethics in times of extreme conflict. Water War Plan turned Moscow and Warsaw into artificial lakes. The Third Reich was not limited to war and territorial control. It also developed megalomaniacal engineering projects that sought to transform entire cities and territories. These included the plan to flood Moscow and Warsaw to create artificial lakes. The idea was to eliminate entire populations and alter the strategic geography, showing the combination of destructive power, technical planning, and ideological obsession that characterized the regime. These plans reflect the extreme mindset of the Nazi leaders. It was not just about defeating the enemy militarily, but about reorganizing the world according to their vision, where geography, population, and infrastructure were subordinated to ideological objectives. The ambition to alter entire cities and regions is an example of how the Third Reich mixed fantasy, destructive power, and technology to impose absolute control. The practical impossibility of many of these projects did not stop their planning. The creation of artificial lakes over entire cities, in addition to the military and logistical costs, reveals the disconnect between ideological vision and reality. However, these plans are significant because they show how the Nazis conceived of war and occupation not only as a military matter, but as a total reconfiguration of space and society according to their ideals. Studying these projects allows us to understand the extent to which the Nazi imagination could be dangerous. Even seemingly absurd plans were backed by science, engineering, and a bureaucratic apparatus capable of attempting them. The mixture of megalomania, ideology, and technological planning defines the scope of Nazi thought and its distorted vision of power and global control. Volkswagen, the people's car born under Hitler. The Nazi regime was also responsible for technological advances that still impact modern life. Hitler commissioned Ferdinand Porsche to design a car for the people, giving rise to the Volkswagen, whose name literally means people's car. The project not only sought to facilitate mobility, but also to demonstrate the industrial capacity of the Third Reich to produce efficient, mass-use technology. At the same time, Hitler promoted the construction of the world's largest highway network, the Autobahns. This pioneering road system not only transformed Germany's infrastructure, but also became a global model. imitated by countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom. The combination of Volkswagen and Autobahns reflects how Nazi engineering sought efficiency, mobility, and a demonstration of technological power. In addition, the regime promoted modern rocketry. Werner von Braun, an aerospace engineer and member of the Nazi Party, was instrumental in the development of the rockets that would later become the basis of the American space program. Von Braun worked on V-2 missiles during the war and after the conflict moved to the United States, contributing to the design of the Saturn V rocket that made it possible to reach the moon. These advances show the duality of the regime, capable of promoting high-level technological innovation while perpetrating atrocious crimes. Engineering and science were applied to both warfare and industrial development, and their legacy remains present in everyday life and in the history of modern technology. The impact of these initiatives is undeniable, although always surrounded by the moral shadow of the use of human talent in projects linked to Nazism and suffering. Autobahns, the road engineering of the Third Reich. The Third Reich not only sought territorial expansion and the consolidation of its power, but also to project modernity through infrastructure. The creation of the Autobahns, a network of high-speed highways that crisscrossed Germany, became one of the most recognizable symbols of this vision. Hitler promoted these highways not only as a transportation project, but as a propaganda tool that showcased the efficiency, organization, and industrial reach of the regime. The design of the Autobahns was innovative for its time. They allowed for efficient connection of regions, fostered internal trade, and facilitated military deployment. The idea of roads with no speed limits on some sections, combined with advanced engineering, was pioneering and served as a model for later transportation systems in other countries. Furthermore, the construction of these roads provided massive employment during a period of economic recovery and consolidated the perception of a strong state capable of transforming the territory. However, the Autobahns also had a military and strategic component. They allowed German troops to move quickly to different fronts in case of conflict, which was an important factor during the early campaigns of World War II. Civil and military infrastructure were intertwined, showing how engineering and urban planning could serve the regime's ideological and military objectives. The legacy of the Autobahns remains evident today: modern, efficient, and widely used highways that have influenced transport planning around the world. However, behind their functionality and modernity, the construction of these highways is marked by the political context of their origin and the use of forced labor in some sections, reminding us that even technological achievements can have a morally complex background. Father of modern rocketry, Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun, an aerospace engineer and member of the Nazi Party, was a key figure in the development of modern rocketry. During World War II, he led the design of the V-2 rockets, used by Germany to bomb Allied cities. These missiles represented an unprecedented technological advance, combining precision, range, and destructive power, although at a huge human cost. Forced prisoners in concentration camps worked under inhumane conditions to manufacture them. After the war, von Braun moved to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, a program through which Nazi scientists were recruited by the US government to advance technological and military research. His experience with rockets led to the creation of the Saturn V, the rocket that finally took man to the moon. The duality of his legacy is remarkable. On the one hand, he contributed to the conquest of space and the development of aerospace technology. On the other, his initial work was linked to a murderous regime and the suffering of thousands of people. The figure of von Braun illustrates how science and technology can be instrumentalized for both destruction and for human exploration and progress. His achievements at NASA are admired, but always accompanied by controversy over his Nazi past and the ethical responsibility of his work during the war. The story of von Braun forces us to reflect on the limits of applied science in immoral contexts and on how ambition and individual talent can be put at the service of diametrically opposed causes. Furthermore, von Braun's career is an example of the lasting impact of Nazi engineering on the modern world. From missiles to space rockets, its technological influence spans decades and borders, showing that scientific innovation can emerge in dark historical contexts and that advances can be appropriated by new narratives and purposes. Mass Nazi suicides, desperation at the end of the war. At the end of World War II, when Germany's defeat was inevitable, a shocking phenomenon occurred. More than 7,000 Nazi sympathizers and officials decided to take their own lives rather than face surrender or trial for their crimes. This pattern of suicides reveals the intensity of fanaticism, despair, and unwavering loyalty to Hitler and Nazi ideology. The mass suicide not only affected the visible leaders of the regime, such as Hitler and Goering, but also lower-ranking officials, military personnel, and civilians deeply committed to the cause. For many, suicide was a way to avoid humiliation, legal responsibility, or moral punishment. It represents a collective psychological phenomenon, the inability to cope with defeat and the absolute internalization of ideology to the point of preferring death to surrender. These suicides also reflect the culture of fear and social control established by the Third Reich. Propaganda, pressure from leaders, and the perception that any failure amounted to treason conditioned the behavior of the most loyal followers. Death became a way to maintain ideological coherence, even in the collapse of the regime. The phenomenon of Nazi mass suicides is an extreme reminder of how ideological manipulation, the cult of the leader, and dehumanization can lead to desperate decisions. It offers lessons on social psychology, obedience, and the risks of totalitarian systems that impose absolute loyalty, showing that the collapse of a regime not only affects it politically, but also leaves deep scars on the minds of those who supported it. Other victims of Nazism: Christians, Catholics, and homosexuals. When discussing the crimes of the Third Reich, the main focus is usually on the extermination of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. However, the scope of the Nazi genocide was much broader. Millions of people belonging to other groups were systematically persecuted, imprisoned, and murdered for ideological, religious, or social reasons. Among them were Christians, Catholics, communists, disabled people, and homosexuals, all considered obstacles to the purity of the German nation. The murder of these populations was supported by state policies that combined pseudoscience, propaganda, and coercion. The concentration camps housed not only Jews, but also these other groups that the regime considered undesirable. The methods of persecution were similar: forced labor, medical experiments, food deprivation, and systematic killings. The magnitude of these atrocities demonstrates that the Nazi regime not only sought the elimination of an ethnic group, but also the construction of a homogeneous society based on its racist and totalitarian ideology. Homosexuals, for example, were sent to concentration camps and forced to wear pink triangles to identify them. Christians and Catholics who opposed Nazism were monitored, arrested, and in some cases executed. These policies reflect how the Third Reich viewed diversity of thought, identity, and faith as threats to its absolute control, and how the power of the state was exercised without limits over the lives of its citizens. This expanded approach to genocide allows us to understand the depth of Nazi brutality. The victims were not just numbers, but individuals with identities, beliefs, and orientations that were systematically eliminated to achieve the vision of a totalitarian and homogeneous state. Recognizing these atrocities beyond the Jewish Holocaust is essential to understanding the magnitude of the horror, as well as the systematic methodology of repression, control, and extermination employed by the Third Reich. The legacy of these persecutions remains alive in historical memory and in human rights studies. The non-Jewish victims of Nazism are a reminder that totalitarianism and extreme ideology do not only affect one group, but seek to control and subjugate the entire society through fear, violence, and systematic exclusion. Hitler's mustache, a personal obsession ignored by all. At the end of World War II, even the most trivial details of Adolf Hitler's life became historical symbols reflecting the dictator's personal obsession and authoritarian character. His famous mustache, which is instantly recognizable today, was the object of constant attention, both from him and from those around him. Despite the fact that most of his collaborators did not find it appealing, Hitler clung to this distinctive style with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The mustache was not just a physical trait, it became a symbol of his identity and authority. Hitler maintained it with care and precision, even in the face of criticism. According to accounts from his secretary and close associates, he firmly believed that the mustache would set a fashion trend and that his personal style would be imitated, reflecting his perception of himself and his influence on society. This seemingly trivial detail reveals the importance Hitler attributed to personal image as a tool for control and projection of power. Beyond its aesthetic appeal, Hitler's mustache also became a propaganda icon and an identifying element of the regime. His image, reproduced on posters, coins, medals, and official documents, served to consolidate the figure of the Führer as absolute leader. Visual uniformity, personal symbolism, and stylistic details contributed to creating a cult of personality around the leader, which reinforced the obedience and loyalty of the population and his closest followers. Studying this small detail is revealing from a historical and psychological point of view. It shows how even seemingly superficial aspects can acquire profound meaning in the context of a totalitarian regime. The obsession with the mustache illustrates how Hitler saw himself, how he sought to influence the perception of others, and how the cult of personal image can reinforce extreme power structures. Ultimately, Hitler's mustache has become a globally recognized cultural symbol, immediately associated with Nazism, authoritarianism, and historical evil. This small physical feature encapsulates the combination of egocentrism, obsession, and visual manipulation that defined the Führer, reminding us that even the smallest details can have a lasting impact when combined with absolute power and an extremist ideology.